probably doesn't even know what he's ordering. People like that usually pick expensive items just to look fancy, but wait till the check comes. I bet he'll leave right away. Though seated Shaq could feel the weight of all the eyes on him. Some diners looked on with sympathy, others with curiosity, yet Shaq showed no signs of embarrassment or discomfort. Instead, he calmly opened the menu, skimming through the other dishes with an air of genuine interest, as if he were merely enjoying a culinary adventure. From the service counter, Emma continued to keep an eye on him. A flicker of irritation crossed her face at her inability to rattle Shaq, but she also felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, believing she had asserted her superiority over someone she deemed out of place in the world of La Lumiere. However, from a cornered table, Mr. Carter, a distinguished older gentleman, observed the scene. Intently turning to his wife, he murmured, "He's testing everyone's patience. Here it's intriguing." The atmosphere in the restaurant grew quieter, but undercurrent of tension was unmistakable, like a spark waiting to ignite. Shaw, still calm and unfappable, seemed not only to be savoring the experience, but also preparing for something far greater, something neither Emma nor the restaurant could anticipate. Emma turned her back, the mocking smile lingering on her lips. She strode directly to the service counter, leaned in, and whispered to her colleague Jake, who was checking the reservation list. To leave as soon as he sees the bill. People like him just pretend to be fancy. Look at this. He ordered the most expensive dish and doesn't even seem to know what he's doing. I bet he won't even make it to Desert. Jake, a young man with a kind face, looked slightly uneasy. He glanced briefly at Shaq, who was still seated in the far corner, calm as a mountain amidst the curious stares. Jake replied, his voice low enough for only Emma to hear, "Maybe he's just here to enjoy the experience." Emma, who knows he might have his own reasons for coming here. Emma scoffed, shaking her head. "Reasons? Look at his outfit. Who comes to this restaurant and worn out shoes if not to pretend?" Jake avoided her gaze, unwilling to argue. He felt uncomfortable with her behavior, but knew that any opposition would only fuel her arrogance. At the corner table, Shaq sat quietly, entirely unbothered by the murmurs behind him. He flipped through the menu leisurely, as if savoring every moment in the luxurious ambience. Curious glances occasionally came his way from nearby tables, but Shaq met them with a gentle, untroubled smile. At a neighboring table, an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, observed everything in silence. Mr. Carter, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair, slowly raised his wine glass. His eyes gleamed with understanding, as though he had witnessed countless similar stories. Lifting his glass slightly, he gave a subtle nod toward Shaq, a small but meaningful gesture. Shaq caught his gaze and returned the nod with a smile, his eyes conveying, "I'm fine, thank you." Mrs. Carter leaned closer to her husband, whispering, "It's strange how they're treating someone like that who do." "You think he is?" Mr. Carter set his glass down, his eyes still fixed on Shaq. "There's something special about him, that calmness. It's not something everyone has." Across the room, Emma continued her commentary with Jake, but this time she wasn't keeping her voice down. It was loud enough for a few nearby diners to hear. "See, he didn't even have a reservation. People like him just want to see if they can sneak in unnoticed, but I guarantee he'll bolt the moment he sees the total on the bill." A few diners at nearby tables glanced at Emma, their disapproval beginning to show on their faces. In another corner, Lisa, a young businesswoman dining with a friend, frowned slightly. She turned to her companion. "She's being so rude. He hasn't done anything to deserve that." Her companion, a composed young man, nodded. It seems like his very existence annoys her. The atmosphere in the restaurant started to shift, but not in the tranquil way La Lumiere was known for. Emma's words, the quiet observations of the other diners, and Shaq's unshakable calmness created an underlying tension. Meanwhile, Shaq continued to enjoy his moment. He refused to let the whispers affect his mood. Though he knew he was being judged, he felt no need to justify himself. At the Carter's table, Mr. Carter sighed softly, his gaze still resting on Shaq. "The world is a strange place," he said, his voice warm but tinged with disappointment. "People forget that someone's true worth isn't in their appearance." Mrs. Carter nodded in agreement, but both of them understood that the evening's drama was far from over. Emma might think she was in control of the situation, but it was clear that in this room, Shaq's mere presence commanded the atmosphere. Emma, after hearing the rumors, decided to take her pride to a whole new level. In her mind, Shaq didn't deserve the courteous service Lumiere was known for, at least not from returning her back on him. She grabbed her notebook and began attending to other tables. As if Shaq didn't exist, she stopped at the central table, where a wealthy couple was sipping red wine. Flashing a radiant smile, and using her sweetest voice, she leaned in slightly. "Would you care for another bottle of Margot? 2015, it pairs perfectly with the main course." The couple nodded, and Emma quickly jotted down the order, throwing in a few playful remarks to extend the conversation. But her eyes kept darting towards Shaw's table, where he sat calmly, seemingly oblivious to her deliberate neglect. Emma walked past his table, repeatedly feigning busyness, balancing a tray in one hand and focusing on another table. She acted as though she hadn't even noticed, and the steady clack of her heels on the wooden floor echoed her indifference. Shaq, a man who had faced fierce competitors on the basketball court, remained utterly composed. His large hands rested lightly on the table, his eyes wandering around the room with an air of quiet curiosity. A small jazz band played in the far corner of the restaurant, their gentle tunes filling the space with a soothing atmosphere. When the song ended, Shaw clapped, a warm, resonant sound that brought smiles to the band members' faces as applause not only caught the band's attention, but also piqued the curiosity of nearby diners. Some began to wonder, how does he remain so calm even when it's clear he's being treated unfairly at the counter? Emma frowned. The polite smile she wore for other customers had vanished. Shaq's composure irritated her far more than she had anticipated. Inwardly, she began to suspect he was challenging her on purpose. Why doesn't he say anything? No complaints, no demand, hands for service, she thought, biting her lip in frustration, determined to test Shaw's patience. Further, Emma decided to delay things even more. She approached another table where a group of diners had just arrived and began an overly detailed explanation of the menu, fully aware that this would prolong Shaq's wait. At another table, Mr. and Mrs. Carter, who had been watching the situation unfold, grew increasingly uneasy. Mrs. Carter leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you see what she's doing? She's obviously giving him a hard time. He's been waiting for at least 20 minutes, Mr." Carter sipped his wine, his sharp eyes fixed on Emma. "I see it, but what's intriguing is that he doesn't seem bothered. He's waiting, but not for the food. I think he's waiting for something else." Shaw remained seated, occasionally glancing at the paintings on the walls. With a sparkling chandelier overhead, his unshakable calmness not only heightened Emma's frustration, but also highlighted the pettiness in her behavior. As Emma walked past Shaw's table, yet again, she deliberately turned her back and spoke loudly enough for a colleague to hear. "Sometimes I think certain people don't understand that not everyone belongs here. It's amusing to watch how hard they try to fit in." Though her words weren't directly addressed to him, their target was clear. A few diners began whispering among themselves, some visibly disapproving, but unwilling to intervene. At another table, Lisa, who had been observing the entire situation, couldn't hide her anger. Setting her wine glass down, she said to her friend, "She's awful. I don't understand why this restaurant keeps someone like her on staff." Her friend nodded, looking thoughtful. "But look at him. He doesn't need anyone to stand up for him. He knows exactly what he's doing." The prolonged wait turned into a tense performance, with Shaw's calm demeanor and confidence making him the undisputed lead actor. Yet it was this very composure that exposed Emma's unprofessionalism and small-mindedness of realization. She had yet to come to terms with the atmosphere inside La Lumiere restaurant. Grew increasingly tense, not because of any loud commotion, but due to the unusual silence surrounding Shaq. He remained seated at a corner table near the kitchen, his demeanor calm, while Emma continued to blatantly ignore him. Her unprofessional behavior and rude attitude were no longer a secret. They had captured the attention of many diners. At the central table, Mr. Carter leaned slightly forward, his voice low, but laced with indignation. "She's incredibly rude," he remarked, his eyes fixed on Emma, who was laughing and chatting with another group of diners. Mrs. Carter, who had been observing everything from the start, nodded subtly, her face showing clear displeasure. "I've never seen a staff member behave like this. She's clearly trying to humiliate him. We should report her to the manager." Mr. Carter set his wine glass down, his expression composed yet resolute. "I agree, someone like her shouldn't be working in a place like this, but let's wait and see how this unfolds." In another corner of the restaurant, Lisa, a young entrepreneur with a neatly cropped haircut, could no longer remain silent. She shook her head, her eyes filled with disapproval as she glanced toward Emma. Lisa had noticed the unfair treatment from the moment Shaq walked in, and Emma's actions only fueled her indignation. "She's terrible," Lisa said to her companion, a man intently following the situation. "I can't believe a high-end restaurant like this would tolerate behavior like that." The man furrowed His brow thoughtfully maybe, because he hasn't said anything they think he's easy to overlook. But I have a feeling he's waiting for the right moment. Lisa tilted her head, curiosity in her gaze, as she looked toward Shaq, who sat upright, his face serene. He seemed so confident. But I hope the manager intervenes. Soon letting this drag on is just too unfair. Nearby, an elderly woman, Mrs. Hamilton, sat quietly with her granddaughter observing the entire scene. She sipped her tea and placed the cup down with a soft clink. "This is disgraceful," she said, her voice soft but weighty. "Waitstaff are here to serve, not to judge the customers. That young woman needs to learn a lesson." Her granddaughter, a bright-eyed young woman, leaned forward. "Do you think he's going to do anything? He's just sitting there not saying a word." "His silence is the answer," Mrs. Hamilton replied, her tone calm. "People who truly know their worth don't need to prove it to anyone. He knows who he is, and that girl will ruin herself soon enough." Meanwhile, Emma, oblivious to the simmering discontent spreading through the room, continued to focus on her personal agenda. She spent extra time at the central tables, deliberately engaging in lengthy conversations to divert attention from what she believed might spotlight Shaq. Passing by Shaq's table once again, she didn't even glance his way, but spoke loudly enough to be heard as she conversed with a colleague. "This is why we need higher standards. Not everyone understands the sophistication required here, and clearly not everyone belongs." Shaw's gaze steady glanced briefly at Emma. Without saying a word, he didn't need to respond. There was no need to react to someone so determined to dig their own hole. Instead, he offered a faint smile and continued observing the room where other diners had started to murmur amongst themselves. At the central table, Mr. Carter turned back to Mrs. Carter's voice low but firm. "We need to speak to the manager immediately. This isn't just unfair, it's ruining the atmosphere for everyone." Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes reflecting empathy for Shaq. "I hope he doesn't leave before this is resolved. He deserves respect." And so the quiet tension in La Lumia was no longer the signature piece of a fine dining establishment. It had become a taut string stretched to its breaking point, waiting for a single spark to ignite a full-blown confrontation. Emma, smug in her actions, remained blissfully unaware that the very patrons she believed had overlooked the injustice were in fact rallying behind Shaq, and they were no longer willing to stay silent. The atmosphere in La Lumia restaurant was as tense as a taut string stretched to its limit. After several rounds of serving other tables and deliberately ignoring Shaq, Emma finally walked toward the corner table where he sat. In her hand was a silver tray holding the filet mignon rossini he had ordered, a signature dish of the restaurant priced at $350. Emma moved slowly, her high heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor, intentionally drawing the attention of every diner in the room. Her eyes betrayed an air of arrogance, and her stride seemed to declare that this was nothing more than a begrudging service for her. As she approached the table, Emma paused for a moment and placed the plate on the table with slightly more force than necessary. The faint clink of the plate meeting the table reverberated in the air. Her smile was cold and challenging. "This is what you ordered. I hope you can appreciate it," she said. Shaw, as usual, maintained his polite and composed demeanor. He glanced down at the intricately presented dish before him, then looked up at Emma. "It looks delicious, thank you," he said in a warm, courteous tone, as if he hadn't noticed the challenge in her words. Not content to let the moment end there, Emma leaned down slightly, half friendly, half intimidating. Her voice was low but clear enough for him to hear, laced with subtle bitterness. "This dish is for connoisseurs. I'm guessing it's your first time." Shaw looked up, his eyes meeting hers, yet there was no anger or irritation in his gaze. He smiled faintly and nodded. "Thank you for the advice," he replied. Shaq's calm reaction not only unsettled Emma, but also made the onlookers feel secondhand embarrassment on her behalf. Instead of humiliating Shaq, she inadvertently exposed her own pettiness. Lisa, from a nearby table, could no longer keep quiet. She leaned toward her friend, her voice brimming with indignation. He just politely thanked her, and she's still being sarcastic. Unbelievable. Her friend nodded, her eyes fixed on Shaw's table. "She's trying to provoke him, but I think she picked the wrong target at the center table, Mr." And Mrs. Carter continued to watch with a serious expression. Mr. Carter lifted his wine glass, but didn't drink, his eyes following Emma's every move. "She has no idea who she's dealing with," he said, his voice low but firm. "A man like that doesn't need to say or do anything. She'll end up embarrassing herself." Emma, unaware of the judgmental glances from other diners, straightened up again. She scanned Shaq one more time, as if looking for a sign of discomfort or annoyance, but found none. A faint sense of defeat crept into her, and to mask it, she threw out another smug remark. If this doesn't suit your taste, we always have simpler options. Feel free to order if needed. Shaq maintained a steady smile and nodded. Lightly, thank you, I'll consider it. His composure was almost infuriating. Emma clenched the notebook in her hand tightly and turned on her heel, walking away without a backward glance at the counter. She slammed the silver tray down, startling Jake, her colleague. He's just pretending to be polite. She hissed, her voice dripping with frustration. I'm sure he doesn't even know what he just ordered. People like that only come here for attention. Jake looked at her, his disapproval evident. Maybe he just wants a peaceful dinner. Isn't it our job to serve everyone? He asked. Emma spun around, her eyes filled with disdain. Can't you see, Jake? He doesn't belong here. And I bet he'll leave as soon as he sees the bill. Meanwhile, Shaq began to savor the filet mignon rossini before him. The tender slices of beef paired with the food jar and truffle sauce were a masterpiece both in flavor and presentation. He chewed slowly, unhurried, his expression serene around him. The murmurs of the other diners grew louder. A few expressed their indignation on his behalf, while others merely glanced at Emma with disapproving eyes. No one spoke out loud, but the atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted from formal elegance to an uneasy tension. Shaw, seated in the most inconspicuous corner, had become the center of attention, yet he did nothing but eat his meal calmly, gracefully, as if he were the one orchestrating the entire scene. Emma had no idea that her actions were leading her closer and closer to a lesson she would never forget. Emma had just turned her back from Shaw's table, a smug smile still lingering on her lips. She believed she had everything under control, that her delays and cutting remarks would ultimately force Shaq to leave the restaurant in silent humiliation. But what she didn't expect was how drastically the atmosphere in the restaurant would change just seconds later. From the reception desk, the restaurant manager, Mr. Thompson, emerged, a middle-aged man with a polished appearance. He strode quickly toward Shaw's table, his face marked with visible concern. His presence immediately drew the attention of nearby diners, who began glancing curiously toward the tucked-away corner of the restaurant. When Mr. Thompson reached the table, he gave a slight bow, his voice low and full of respect. Shaq, it's such an honor to have you here. I apologize for the delay. We had no idea you were coming today. His words were like a lightning bolt shattering the room's equilibrium. The ambient murmur of conversation abruptly ceased, leaving behind a stunned silence. Nearby customers, already intrigued, now widened their eyes in disbelief at what they had just heard. Shaw, still calm and composed, placed his knife and fork down on the table, looking up at Mr. Thompson. He smiled warmly, his voice as smooth and kind as ever. It's no problem. I just wanted to enjoy a quiet dinner across the room. Emma froze in place, tray still in hand, her vacant eyes fixed on the interaction between Mr. Thompson and Shaq. The words reverberated in her mind, shattering her earlier confidence into pieces. Shaq, did he just call him Shaq? The thought swirled in her head, her mind refusing to accept the reality. Emma glanced around, noticed that every pair of eyes in the restaurant was now fixed on Shaq, and to her horror, on her as well. A young couple seated nearby whispered their voices just loud enough for Emma to catch that Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball legend, he owns steaks and so many businesses, another added, and he's a renowned philanthropist. How could the staff here not recognize him? The whispers spread through the restaurant like ripples, and upon faces that had held curiosity moments ago now showed admiration and astonishment. A few diners turned to glance at Emma, their expressions laced with silent judgment. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Panic and shame washed over her in waves. She stood rooted to the Emma might think she was in control of the situation, but it was clear that in this room Shaq's mere presence commanded the atmosphere. Emma, after hearing the rumors, decided to take her pride to a whole new level. In her mind, Shaq didn't deserve the courteous service Lumia was known for, at least not from turning her back on him. She grabbed her notebook and began attending to other tables. As if Shaq didn't exist, she stopped at the central table where a wealthy couple was sipping red wine. Flashing a radiant smile and using her sweetest voice, she leaned in slightly. Would you care for another bottle of Margot 2015? It pairs perfectly with the main course. The couple nodded, and Emma quickly jotted down the order, throwing in a few playful remarks to extend the conversation. But her eyes kept darting toward Shaw's table, where he sat calmly, seemingly oblivious to her deliberate neglect. Emma walked past his table, repeatedly feigning busyness, balancing a tray in one hand and focusing on another table. She acted as though she hadn't even noticed him. The steady clack of her heels on the wooden floor echoed her indifference. Shaq, a man who had faced fierce competitors on the basketball court,